It was just another long shift for Jacob Taylor, a dedicated employee at a local pharmacy, when his routine evening took an unexpected turn. After clocking out, he settled on a concrete bench outside the store in his red uniform. Exhausted and eager to get home, Jacob, who had been tirelessly working since 2:45 p.m., hadn't even gotten a proper lunch, just a quick snack between customers. He was looking forward to a relaxing night, but as he waited for his Lyft ride, two white police officers approached him without warning. The officers, their hands near their belts, immediately demanded his ID. Calmly, Jacob explained that he worked at the store, but his polite demeanor didn't seem to matter. The officers claimed they received a report of suspicious activity, matching his description. Despite Jacob's efforts to clarify that he was simply waiting for his ride, they insisted on cuffing him. His pleas to verify his identity with the store manager went ignored, and within moments, his wrists were locked behind his back. The officers never apologized, and the situation unfolded in front of confused customers and employees. Jacob's experience, while unjust, didn't go unnoticed. A bystander filmed the encounter, and within hours, the video went viral, sparking outrage and support across social media. People were shocked by the police's treatment of Jacob, especially as he remained calm and cooperative throughout. His story began to resonate deeply with many who had experienced similar injustices, transforming Jacob's personal ordeal into a larger conversation about race, assumptions, and accountability in law enforcement. Jacob Taylor's experience outside a local pharmacy quickly transformed from a routine moment into an incident that would leave the entire community shaken. After finishing a long and exhausting shift, Jacob, still in his red uniform with his name tag proudly displayed, sat on a concrete bench outside the store, waiting for his Lyft ride to take him home. His day had been filled with long hours of filling prescriptions, assisting elderly customers with their Medicare cards, and dealing with a demanding customer who insisted his expired coupon should still be honored. He hadn't even taken a proper break. A quick snack and a bottle of water between customers was all he could manage. Jacob was simply looking forward to unwinding after a long day, watching the game with his roommate. But this moment of peaceful rest was interrupted by the sudden arrival of two police officers. The officers approached Jacob without any clear reason, their presence immediately making the situation tense. They didn't ask any questions or seek clarification. Instead, they began to demand Jacob's identification, claiming that someone had reported suspicious activity matching his description. Jacob, though startled, remained composed and polite. He explained that he was just waiting for his Lyft and that he worked at the store. Despite his calm demeanor and clear explanation, the officers insisted on checking his ID and questioned him further. When Jacob offered to have the store manager confirm his identity, the officers refused. Without warning, they placed Jacob in handcuffs, treating him like a criminal. All the while, Jacob remained calm, despite the unjust situation, trying to explain that he had done nothing wrong. As the situation escalated, customers and employees inside the pharmacy began to take notice. One of the employees, Tiffany, a young college student, was frozen in place, watching the entire scene unfold from the store's entrance. Jacob's heart pounded faster, but he kept his composure, hoping that someone would step in and clarify the situation. Finally, the assistant manager of the store, Mr. Denton, came outside and quickly recognized the mistake. He insisted that Jacob worked at the store and had just finished his shift. Still, the officers did not back down immediately. It wasn't until dispatch confirmed Jacob's employment and identity that the officers reluctantly removed the cuffs. Without any apology or acknowledgement of their wrongful actions, Jacob, now free but shaken, walked away from the scene, his wrists sore from the cuffs, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Unbeknownst to Jacob, the incident was far from over. A bystander, a woman who had been shopping, had filmed the entire exchange and uploaded it to social media. The video quickly went viral, sparking outrage and disbelief from viewers across the country. People were horrified by how Jacob, a man simply waiting for a ride after his shift, had been treated by law enforcement. The video, shaky and filmed from a distance, captured the raw emotion of the moment. In it, Jacob was seen standing calmly with his wrists cuffed, despite not having committed any crime, while the officers stood around him, their hands on their belts, as if preparing for something more. The woman who filmed the video, in a soft Southern accent, could be heard expressing disbelief, saying, "He's just waiting. That boy works there. This is wrong." As the video gained traction, the comments flooded in, many supporting Jacob, and others questioning the police's actions. It didn't take long before news outlets began covering the story, with local and national media picking it up. Jacob's simple, quiet plea for fairness had turned into a public spectacle that was now being broadcast to thousands. The viral video left Jacob feeling conflicted. On one hand, the public support was overwhelming, with strangers and people from his community reaching out to him, offering words of encouragement and apologies for what had happened. On the other hand, the incident had left him feeling exposed. He hadn't asked for the attention, and the reality of having his personal story shared across social media was both humbling and disorienting. As the video spread across Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, Jacob's inbox filled with messages from people sharing their own experiences of racial profiling and wrongful detainment. Terrence had become a symbol, not by choice, but by circumstance. His story resonated with many who had experienced similar treatment or had witnessed such injustices. The most impactful part of Jacob's story was his composure in the face of such injustice. He wasn't combative, he wasn't shouting or resisting. He simply remained calm, even as his rights were being violated. His experience highlighted the disturbing reality that, despite being an upstanding employee with a name tag clearly displaying his identity, he could still be perceived as a threat because of his race. The office's failure to question their assumptions, to verify the situation before escalating it, reflected a much larger issue in society. Jacob wasn't just dealing with a simple case of mistaken identity, he was confronted with a system that viewed him not as a person, but as a threat based on his appearance. The viral spread of the video wasn't just about Jacob's personal story, it became part of a larger conversation about policing, racial profiling, and assumptions. People who had never experienced such treatment were suddenly made aware of how easily someone could be dehumanized. Jacob didn't want to be a symbol of protest, but by sharing his story, he unknowingly became one. His calmness in the face of the office's disrespect spoke volumes, and his story began to spread, sparking discussions in schools, communities, and workplaces across the country. As the story continued to unfold, Jacob's life had irrevocably changed, and the question remained, what would happen next? Jacob Taylor's encounter outside the CVS that night had more far-reaching consequences than he could have ever imagined. When the two police officers approached him and unjustly placed him in handcuffs, it was a deeply unsettling experience, one that stayed with him long after the incident was over. But the emotional impact of the event didn't stop when the cuffs were removed. Despite being wronged, Jacob remained calm and composed, attempting to explain himself and show the officers that he was simply waiting for a ride after his shift. But their treatment of him as a suspect, even with his name tag clearly displayed, left him feeling humiliated and dehumanized. The worst part was that the officers never even paused to consider his words or confirm the information he provided before jumping to conclusions. The emotional toll on Jacob was evident. He didn't feel angered by the experience so much as weary. He was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. His calm demeanor, which should have been a sign of trustworthiness and cooperation, didn't help him. Instead, it seemed to be ignored by the officers, and their unquestioned assumptions about him took precedence. This lack of respect and consideration for his identity, his profession, and his experience as a human being stung deeply. He couldn't shake the feeling that nothing about his words, his job, or even his appearance mattered to the officers. What hurt the most was the realization that, despite all his politeness and efforts to de-escalate the situation, he was still treated as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. But the most difficult part for Jacob was the silence. When the situation finally came to a close, the officers didn't apologize or acknowledge their mistake. They simply released him without any remorse or explanation, leaving Jacob feeling unheard and invalidated. He wasn't given a chance to fully explain himself, and the officer's failure to recognize their error in judgment left him with a lingering sense of confusion and frustration. While Jacob's colleagues, including Mr. Denton, stepped forward to vouch for him, the incident made him feel as though his word wasn't enough. The silence of the officers, and their lack of accountability, was deafening. What followed was a wave of support from the community, but also the painful realization of how alone Jacob had felt in the moment. While Tiffany, the cashier, and other bystanders filmed the event, it wasn't until later that Jacob began to understand how many people had seen what happened. The video that went viral was a source of both comfort and discomfort for him. On the one hand, the public outcry that followed gave him a sense of validation. Strangers from across the country reached out to express their solidarity, and Jacob could sense a shared sense of injustice in their words. On the other hand, the video forced Jacob to relive the humiliating moment again and again, as he watched himself being treated like a criminal simply for waiting outside a store in his uniform. The video exposed the deep-rooted issues of racial profiling and policing. But for Jacob, it also brought to light how easily someone's life could be turned upside down by a single moment of prejudice and misunderstanding. While Jacob's personal trauma was evident, what struck him most in the days that followed was how many people could relate to his experience. People began to share their own stories of being unfairly treated, and the response became something much larger than just one incident. Jacob began to realize that the emotional burden he carried wasn't just his to bear. It was shared by many others who had been unjustly targeted, dismissed, or treated with suspicion based solely on the color of their skin. But even as he received messages of support and sympathy, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of discomfort. He didn't want to be a symbol for something larger than himself. And yet, his story had become one. It wasn't until Jacob sat with the emotions of the experience and the response from the community that he began to truly understand the power of his story. He realized that despite the silence of the officers, he could still speak out. He didn't have to stay quiet anymore. Jacob's story, shared through social media and news outlets, had sparked conversations that needed to be had. People were listening, and, while it didn't erase the injustice he faced, it made him feel seen in a way he had never felt before. In the end, the community support, the messages of encouragement, and the opportunity to share his truth became the catalyst for something far bigger than just an incident outside a pharmacy. Through his painful experience, Jacob had inadvertently ignited a movement of empathy, awareness, and change. In the aftermath of the incident outside the CVS, Jacob Taylor's life began to shift in ways he never expected. Initially, he had simply wanted to go home after a long and exhausting workday. But his encounter with the police had set off a chain of events that would change him forever. Despite the emotional and physical toll it took on him, Jacob found himself at a crossroads where he could either remain silent or speak up. And it was the quiet strength and calmness he had shown in the face of wrongful detainment that sparked a much larger movement than he could have imagined. While he hadn't planned to be anyone's voice for change, Jacob's experience began to resonate with people across the country, especially those who had faced similar injustices. The viral video of his interaction with the officers had captured the attention of thousands, many of whom were shocked and angry at the way Jacob had been treated. It wasn't just about him. It was about a systemic issue that countless people had experienced. Often in silence, the public's response was overwhelming. Strangers, community members, and even former classmates began reaching out to Jacob, expressing their support and solidarity. He received messages from people who had gone through similar situations, as well as from others who had never been personally affected by racial profiling but were now paying closer attention. It was in these moments of shared humanity that Jacob began to realize the power of his story. He hadn't asked for this attention, but it had been thrust upon him. And now he had a choice. He could let the story end with his release from the cuffs. Or he could use the moment to raise awareness and make a difference. As he reflected on the incident, Jacob was struck by how the officers had never even considered his identity as an employee or his presence as a simple worker on a break. In that moment, his uniform, his name tag, and his words meant nothing to them. What mattered was a vague, unfounded description and the assumption that he didn't belong. The emotional burden of that realization stayed with Jacob, but it also ignited a desire to speak out, not just for himself, but for others who had been unfairly treated in similar ways. Jacob's decision to speak up was not an easy one. He was still processing the trauma of what had happened, the humiliation, the exhaustion, and the sense of being dismissed as a human being. But with the encouragement of those who had reached out to him, Jacob began to open up more about his experience. He gave interviews, spoke at town hall meetings, and even started a blog, sharing his thoughts and feelings in a way that felt cathartic yet empowering. The blog, Bench Hours, became a space for Jacob to process his emotions and connect with others who had experienced similar challenges. The blog posts were simple but powerful, capturing the essence of his journey from victim to voice for change. Through his writing and public speaking, Jacob found a sense of purpose that he hadn't expected. He realized that by sharing his story, he was not only healing himself but also helping others find their voices and share their truths. His calm, measured words resonated with so many because they were rooted in honesty and vulnerability. Jacob wasn't shouting or demanding attention, he was simply telling it like it was. As Jacob's story continued to spread, more and more people began to take notice. He was invited to speak at schools, community events, and even police training seminars. At first, Jacob was hesitant, unsure of what to say or whether he could make a difference. But each time he spoke, he felt a sense of strength and clarity that helped him move forward. The conversations were never easy, and at times they were uncomfortable, but they were necessary. Jacob was slowly becoming a symbol for a larger movement, one that addressed issues of racial profiling, police accountability, and the need for change. While he never sought to be an activist, Jacob found himself in a position where his voice mattered. And the more he spoke, the more people began to listen. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for all those who had been unfairly treated, for those who had been silenced, and for those who had never had the chance to tell their story. The shift in Jacob's life wasn't just external, it was deeply internal as well. Through the support of his community, the media, and even complete strangers, Jacob began to rebuild his sense of self-worth and confidence. The trauma of that night would never fully go away, but by sharing his experience, Jacob transformed a painful moment into an opportunity for growth and healing. His decision to speak up became a catalyst for change, not only in his own life but also in the lives of others. The more he shared his truth, the more people came forward with their own stories. What started as a single moment of injustice turned into a larger conversation, one that reached far beyond Rock Hill, South Carolina. Jacob's courage to speak up, despite his pain, became an example of how one person's voice could make a difference, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Through his actions, he showed the world that silence might feel safer, but speaking the truth is what leads to real change. Jacob Taylor never intended to become the focal point of a national conversation. Yet the moment he was unjustly detained outside a CVS store, his life would never be the same. That night, what should have been a simple waiting period after a long shift turned into an event that rippled far beyond the parking lot of the pharmacy. The office's decision to cuff him despite his calm demeanor and clear identification as an employee set off a chain of events that led to Jacob becoming an unexpected symbol in the fight against racial profiling and police miscommunication. But the impact of that moment was far deeper than the initial shock. It touched something within Jacob that he hadn't anticipated: the power of his own voice. The event had left him emotionally raw, shaken, and confused, but Jacob soon realized that by sharing his story, he could help others understand the complexities of racial injustice that many had long endured in silence. The video of Jacob's detainment went viral quickly, with strangers across the country expressing their outrage at how a simple employee in uniform was treated as a criminal without question. At first, Jacob was overwhelmed by the attention. He didn't want to be seen as a symbol, but his experience resonated deeply with so many who had lived through similar and often unspoken experiences. What struck him most was the realization that despite doing everything right, having his name tag clearly displayed, calmly explaining his situation, and even offering to verify his identity with the store manager, none of that mattered. What mattered to the officers was a vague description, one based solely on assumptions. In their eyes, Jacob wasn't a man simply sitting outside a store after work, he was a threat. The disheartening part was that this wasn't an isolated event. It was just another example of the racial profiling and prejudiced assumptions many people of color face every day, simply because of the color of their skin. Jacob's immediate response was not one of anger but of introspection. He couldn't fathom why this had happened to him. After all, he had done nothing wrong. But through the outpouring of support from his community and the broader public, Jacob began to see that the story was bigger than just him. His experience became a shared moment for people who had been mistreated, marginalized, and overlooked for no other reason than their race. The most painful realization for Jacob was that this incident, which felt so personal and isolating, was not an isolated experience at all. It had become part of a larger, ongoing narrative that many others had lived through. Yet, Jacob's calm composure in the face of the office's actions made his story stand out. While so many would have reacted with anger or frustration, Jacob's quiet strength and ability to remain composed, even while unjustly detained, resonated with others who had experienced similar systemic failures. As the viral video continued to spread, Jacob received messages of support from strangers who had witnessed similar treatment to those who were simply moved by his story. He began to see how his experience could be a catalyst for change, not just for him but for others as well. Jacob was invited to speak at community meetings, schools, and even police training seminars. Each time he spoke, he shared not just the facts of what had happened but his emotional journey, the fear, the humiliation, and the frustration of being treated as a suspect when he had done nothing wrong. His willingness to speak up, even in his own pain, created a space for others to feel heard. 2. Jacob's words were not filled with rage, but with honesty and vulnerability. And it was this quiet truth that began to resonate with people from all walks of life. Despite his discomfort with the attention, Jacob understood that his story had the potential to make a difference. His interviews, blog posts, and public speeches had a profound impact, shifting the narrative from one of anger and resentment to one of reflection and growth. People began to listen, not because he was shouting for justice but because his calm, composed delivery spoke to the deeper truths many had long ignored. Jacob's willingness to share his truth helped others find the courage to do the same. His story wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had been unjustly profiled, detained, and dismissed, and it served as a reminder of the power of truth-telling. By the time Jacob was invited to speak at a police training seminar, he had already become an important figure in the movement for racial justice. His story, told without anger but with intention, was now being used to train new officers, helping them understand the human side of policing and the importance of questioning assumptions before acting. Jacob's journey had taken him from a routine day at work to the front lines of a much larger conversation about policing, race, and systemic injustice. Though he hadn't sought to be an activist, Jacob had become one by simply telling his story truthfully and without fear. His calm, composed response to an unjust situation had made him a voice for change, a reminder that, even in the face of adversity, one person's truth could spark a movement. What began as an unfortunate and painful incident outside a CVS store had grown into something far greater. Jacob had turned his painful experience into a platform for change, showing the world that, while silence might feel safer, speaking up with intention and truth could have a lasting impact. The ripples of his story were still spreading, and Jacob knew that the fight for justice was far from over. But he also knew that by continuing to share his truth, he was helping others find their own voice and ensuring that no one would be silenced again. Jacob Taylor's story is a profound reminder that the way we see others can dramatically shape their lives, and that sometimes the greatest injustices happen in the quietest moments. It's easy to pass judgment based on assumptions, to think we know someone's story from a glance, or to act on impulse without truly listening. But Jacob's experience is a stark example of how dangerous and painful those assumptions can be. One night, after a long shift, Jacob, simply waiting for a ride home in his red CVS uniform, was approached by two police officers who decided to treat him as a threat without a second thought. Despite his calmness, his polite demeanor, and his clear identity, Jacob was cuffed and humiliated in front of his coworkers and customers. Just because he matched a vague description, the officers didn't ask questions or take the time to truly understand the situation. They acted based on what they thought they saw. What followed was not just an emotional ordeal for Jacob, but a wave of support from people who recognized that the injustice he faced wasn't just about one individual. It was part of a much larger issue. People across the country shared their own stories of being wrongfully judged. And the viral video that captured Jacob's detainment became a powerful symbol of the need for change. The painful truth is that Jacob's story isn't unique. Many of us have been judged, misinterpreted, or dismissed because of our appearance or assumptions made about us. But what sets Jacob apart is how he chose to respond. He didn't let anger consume him, nor did he stay silent. Instead, he used his voice, his calm, and his truth to speak out about the injustice he faced, and in doing so, he ignited a movement. Jacob's story became a platform for others to share their experiences, a call to reflect on how we treat each other, and a reminder of the importance of questioning assumptions. His journey of turning a moment of humiliation into a moment of empowerment teaches us that the most painful moments often hold the greatest potential for change. By speaking up with honesty, even when the world expects us to be angry, we can start conversations that lead to understanding, healing, and real transformation. The lesson here is simple yet incredibly emotional. Don't let the judgments of others define you. In moments when you feel overlooked, misunderstood, or unjustly treated, remember that your voice matters. Speak your truth, share your story, even when it's hard, because it can inspire others to do the same. Change doesn't always happen in the loudest protests or most dramatic actions. It often starts with one person, one voice, calmly telling their truth. Jacob showed us that our calm can be our strength, and that by standing up for ourselves, we might just help change the world for someone else. If you've ever felt judged, dismissed, or wrongly treated, Jacob's story is a powerful reminder that you are not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you overcome the judgments others place on you? What's your story of standing up in a difficult moment? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like Jacob's, because together, we can keep these conversations going and inspire real change. Let's remind each other that we are more than the assumptions others make of us, and that speaking our truth is always worth it.